September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The most powerful warship in the entire United States Navy, the USS Missouri, sits in the water like a floating city of steel. Her guns are pointed toward the Japanese coastline. 450 warships of the Allied fleet are anchored around her in every direction as far as the eye can see. Above her, 900 American aircraft are flying in formation so tight and so precise that the sound of their engines is less a noise than a physical pressure, something you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The sun is coming up over Japan, and on the deck of the USS Missouri, a table has been set up with a simple document lying on it. A document that represents the formal end of the most destructive war in the history of human civilization. A war that has consumed 60 million lives, shattered empires, and burned cities to ash across 4 continents and 2 oceans. And the Japanese delegation that has just come aboard to sign that document is refusing to bow their heads. Type the word refused in the comments right now if you already feel the weight of that moment, because what Douglas MacArthur did in response to that refusal on the deck of the USS Missouri on the morning of September 2nd, 1945, is one of the most commanding, most precise, and most historically significant acts of personal authority in the entire story of the Second World War. To understand the full power of what happened on that deck, you have to understand what the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri was supposed to represent, and why every detail of it, the location, the timing, the sequence of events, and above all the conduct of the Japanese delegation, had been planned and considered and deliberated over with an intensity that went far beyond military protocol. Douglas MacArthur had been fighting Japan since December 7th, 1941. He had watched the Japanese military drive his forces off the Philippines in the darkest months of 1942. He had made a promise, one of the most famous promises in American military history, that he would return. He had kept that promise, fighting his way back across the Pacific in a campaign that consumed 4 years and cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and the lives of millions of people across the Pacific theater. He had seen what the Japanese military did to the territories it occupied and the people it conquered. He had liberated the Philippines and found what had been done there. He had received the reports from the prisoner of war camps and known what American soldiers had endured in Japanese captivity. He had spent 4 years building toward this single morning on this single deck, and he had thought about it. Deeply, deliberately, and with the specific strategic intelligence that had made him one of the most brilliant and most complicated military commanders America had ever produced. According to the detailed account provided by historian D. Clayton James in his 3-volume biography, The Years of MacArthur, which remains the definitive scholarly account of MacArthur's military career and draws extensively on MacArthur's personal papers, the operational records of the Southwest Pacific Command, and the first-hand accounts of the officers who worked most closely with him, MacArthur had given enormous thought to the surrender ceremony in the weeks before it took place. Not just the logistics of it, the meaning of it, what it was supposed to accomplish beyond the obvious military and diplomatic function of formally ending the war. He understood that the surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri was not just a legal proceeding, it was a psychological event of enormous historical significance. It was the moment at which the entire framework of Japanese military culture, the culture that had told its soldiers for decades that death was preferable to surrender, that the emperor was divine and his military forces were invincible, that the Western powers were racially and civilizationally inferior to Japan and would eventually be driven from Asia, was going to be publicly, formally, and irrevocably dismantled. And the manner in which that dismantling happened, the specific conduct of every person on that deck, the way the Japanese delegation carried themselves, and the way MacArthur responded to how they carried themselves, was going to be part of the historical record forever. He had decided, according to the accounts of his senior staff officers preserved in the MacArthur Memorial Archives in Norfolk, Virginia, that the ceremony was going to be conducted with absolute military precision and absolute personal dignity, and that he was going to require both from everyone present, including the Japanese delegation, and that any attempt by the Japanese delegation to use the ceremony as a stage for the kind of performance of defiance that Japanese military culture valued was going to be met with something more devastating than anger. It was going to be met with complete, unwavering, immovable authority. The Japanese delegation arrived on the USS Missouri by launch from the Japanese destroyer that had brought them to Tokyo Bay. There were 11 of them. The civilian delegation was led by Mamoru Shigemitsu, the foreign minister of Japan, who walked with a pronounced limp from an assassination attempt years earlier that had cost him his leg. He wore a formal top hat and morning coat, the diplomatic dress of a representative of a sovereign nation attending a formal international proceeding. The military delegation was led by General Yoshijiro Umezu, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, one of the most senior military officers in the entire Japanese military establishment, and one of the most committed advocates of continued resistance, who had been among the last to accept the reality of defeat. According to the eyewitness accounts of American officers present on the deck, preserved in the collections of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and analyzed in detail by historian William Manchester in his biography of MacArthur, American Caesar, the Japanese delegation came aboard and was directed to their position in front of the surrender table. And in the moments that followed, as the enormous gathered weight of the Allied fleet and the assembled senior officers of the Allied powers pressed down on that small area of deck, something became immediately and unmistakably clear to everyone watching. The Japanese military officers in the delegation were not going to make this easy. General Umezu, in particular, carried himself with a bearing that communicated, in the universal language of military posture and facial expression, that he considered himself to be present under duress rather than in genuine acknowledgement of defeat. His face was set in an expression that several American officers present described in their accounts as one of the most complete and most deliberate performances of contempt they had ever witnessed from a man who was simultaneously aware that he was about to sign a document acknowledging the total defeat of his country. He stood in his position in the Japanese military delegation, and he did not bow his head, and he did not acknowledge the assembled Allied officers around him, and he projected, from every aspect of his bearing, the message that he was here because he had been required to be here, and not for any other reason. Several of the other Japanese military officers in the delegation adopted similar postures. According to the accounts of Allied officers present, the collective bearing of the Japanese military members of the delegation was one of rigid, deliberate, performed non-submission, as if by refusing to let their bodies acknowledge defeat, they could maintain something essential that the document on the table was about to take from them. This was not accidental. According to the historical analysis provided by John Dower in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Embracing Defeat, which is the most comprehensive and most deeply researched account of Japan's experience of defeat and occupation ever written, the Japanese military culture's relationship with surrender was one of the most fundamental and most deeply rooted aspects of the entire institutional psychology of the Imperial Japanese military. The Senjin-kun, the Japanese military code that had governed the behavior of Japanese soldiers since 1941, explicitly stated that a soldier should never suffer the disgrace of being taken prisoner and that death was preferable to capture. To surrender was not just a military failure in Japanese military culture. It was a moral failure, a failure of identity, something that the culture had no adequate framework for processing, because the framework had been built on the assumption that it would never happen. The men standing on that deck had spent their entire military careers inside that framework. General Umezu had built his identity on it, and now he was being required to stand on the deck of an American battleship in Tokyo Bay and sign a document that said Japan had lost and that he and his forces were subject to the authority of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. And he was going to stand there in a way that communicated to the other Japanese officers watching and to the Japanese people who would eventually see the photographs and read the accounts, that he had not accepted it in his interior life, even if his hand was going to sign the document. MacArthur watched all of this from the position he had taken at the microphones set up for the ceremony. He watched the Japanese delegation come aboard. He watched them take their positions. He watched the bearing of General Umezu and the other military officers. He saw exactly what they were doing and exactly what it was intended to communicate. And according to the accounts of the officers closest to him, his expression did not change. His posture did not change. He did not react to the Japanese delegation's performance of non-submission with any visible emotion whatsoever. He was waiting. When the time came for MacArthur to open the ceremony, he stepped to the microphones. What he said in the next few minutes is preserved in the audio recording of the ceremony that exists in the National Archives and that has been analyzed by historians studying the linguistic and rhetorical dimensions of the surrender. He spoke quietly, not with the theatrical projection of a commander addressing troops before a battle, with the measured, deliberate cadence of a man who has thought carefully about every word he's going to say and has decided that the words are going to do the work rather than the volume. He said that it was his earnest hope and the hope of all mankind that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. He said that it was not for the leaders to meet in a spirit of mistrust, malice, or hatred, but rather it was for us, both the victors and the vanquished, to rise to that higher dignity which alone befits the sacred purposes we are about to serve. According to the accounts of the American officers present and the subsequent analysis of historians who have written about the ceremony, this opening was itself a statement directed specifically at the bearing of the Japanese military delegation. MacArthur was not acknowledging their performance. He was not responding to it with anger or with the kind of triumphant victor's rhetoric that the moment might have seemed to call for. He was refusing to engage with it on his own terms and instead setting a different framework for what was about to happen, a framework in which the performance of contempt had no audience and no purchase, because the man running the ceremony had already decided what the ceremony meant and was not going to allow anyone else to redefine it. Then came the signing. Mamoru Shigemitsu, the foreign minister, signed first on behalf of the Japanese government. He moved slowly because of his prosthetic leg and the difficulty of positioning himself at the table. Several American officers present noted afterward that MacArthur had made no acknowledgement of Shigemitsu's physical difficulty and had not offered any accommodation for it, not out of cruelty but out of the same principled refusal to alter the ceremony structure for the convenience of the Japanese delegation that governed everything else about his conduct that morning. Then it was General Umezu's turn. According to the accounts of multiple eyewitnesses, the moment when General Umezu stepped forward to sign was the most electrically charged moment of the entire ceremony. He walked to the table. He looked at the document, and he did not immediately sign. He stood at the table for a moment in full view of every Allied officer on the deck and the hundreds of sailors and soldiers watching from every available vantage point on the ship, and he maintained his bearing and his expression of performed non-submission, and he took his time. MacArthur looked at him. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He did not make any visible acknowledgement of the pause or any visible response to the performance of resistance that Umezu was conducting at the signing table. He simply looked at him with the expression that the officers closest to him described, in accounts written at different times and from different perspectives with a remarkable consistency. They said it was not anger. It was not impatience. It was not the triumphant satisfaction of a victor watching a defeated enemy submit. It was something more fundamental than any of those things. It was the expression of a man who had complete authority in this space and complete certainty about the outcome, and was entirely willing to wait for as long as necessary for the person in front of him to understand both of those things. Umezu signed. According to the account of General Jonathan Wainwright, who had been MacArthur's subordinate in the Philippines in 1942, and who had spent 3.5 years as a Japanese prisoner of war before being liberated in time to attend the surrender ceremony, the moment Umezu's pen touched the document was the moment that something in the atmosphere of the entire deck changed. Wainwright had watched the Japanese delegation's performance of non-submission with the specific emotional complexity of a man who had spent 3.5 years in Japanese captivity and who understood from personal experience exactly what Japanese military culture's contempt for its enemies looked like in practice rather than in theory. He wrote in his memoir that the moment Umezu signed was the moment the performance ended. Not because Umezu's expression changed. It did not. Not because his posture changed. It did not. But because the act of signing, the physical contact of his hand with that document, had made the reality of the situation undeniable in a way that bearing and expression and performance could no longer reach. After all the delegates had signed and the document was complete, MacArthur stepped back to the microphones. He announced that the ceremony was closed. And then he said something that was not in any prepared script, and that several of his staff officers confirmed afterward had not been discussed or planned in advance. He said, in the same quiet and measured voice he had used throughout, that a great tragedy has ended. A great victory has been won. The skies no longer rain death. The seas bear only commerce. Men everywhere walk upright in the sunlight. The entire world is quietly at peace. Then he walked away from the microphones and the ceremony was over. What MacArthur had done on that deck was something that required a specific and difficult kind of self-discipline that is not always recognized as the remarkable achievement it was. He had stood in front of a Japanese military delegation that was performing contempt and defiance with everything except the physical act of refusal, which the reality of their situation had made impossible, and he had refused to engage with the performance on its own terms. He had not responded to the bearing of General Umezu with anger, which would have given the performance a target and a meaning. He had not responded with triumphant mockery, which would have made the ceremony about the victor's satisfaction rather than the historical significance of what was being documented. He had responded with something more powerful than either. He had responded with complete, quiet, immovable authority, with the bearing of a man who knew exactly what this moment meant and was not going to allow anyone else's performance to change that meaning. According to General Courtney Whitney, MacArthur's closest aide and one of the most important first-hand sources for MacArthur's conduct during the occupation period, whose memoir, MacArthur, His Rendezvous with History remains one of the essential primary sources for this period, MacArthur spoke about the surrender ceremony in the days that followed with a specificity and a thoughtfulness that suggested he had been processing its significance continuously since the morning it happened. He talked about the bearing of the Japanese military delegation not with anger, but with something closer to understanding. He said that he had expected it, that he had known that the men standing on that deck had been formed by a military culture that had no framework for the situation they were in, and that the performance of non-submission was the only available response that culture had given them for a situation it had never anticipated, that the performance was not a threat and not a meaningful form of resistance. It was the last available gesture of men who had run out of everything else. He said that the correct response to a gesture was not another gesture. It was to be so completely and so obviously beyond the reach of the gesture that it simply ran out of air and stopped. That, according to Whitney, was what MacArthur had been doing on the deck of the USS Missouri, not performing authority, being it, in a way that made the Japanese delegation's performance of defiance progressively less meaningful with every minute that passed, until Umezu's pen touched the document and the performance had nowhere left to go. Type the word authority in the comments if you understand what MacArthur was doing on that deck, because it is one of the most sophisticated and most deliberately executed demonstrations of genuine command presence in the entire history of American military leadership. And it is something that the simple narrative of the victors and the vanquished does not fully capture. In the weeks and months that followed the surrender ceremony, MacArthur's handling of the occupation of Japan demonstrated the same quality of authority in a much more sustained and much more complex context. According to John Dower's account in Embracing Defeat, MacArthur's management of the occupation was one of the most remarkable exercises in military governance in modern history, a period in which he had to simultaneously dismantle the institutional structures of Japanese militarism, provide for the basic needs of a devastated civilian population, conduct war crimes trials for the most serious offenders, and begin the construction of a democratic political framework in a country that had no democratic tradition and that had just been told, for the first time in its history, that the emperor was not divine. He did all of it with the same quality of authority he had demonstrated on the deck of the USS Missouri, not the authority of a man who needed to assert it constantly because he was uncertain of its foundation. The authority of a man who was so completely certain of it that he could afford to be quiet. General Umezu, who had stood at the signing table and taken his time and maintained his bearing and performed his non-submission in front of every Allied officer in Tokyo Bay, was subsequently indicted as a Class A war criminal by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Pacific equivalent of the Nuremberg trials. He was convicted in 1948 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Sugamo prison in 1949 while serving his sentence. The document he signed on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, is preserved in the National Archives of the United States. The signature is his, clear and permanent on the page. Whatever his bearing communicated on that deck, whatever performance of non-submission his posture and his expression had delivered in those minutes before his pen touched the paper, the signature is there. It has been there for 80 years, and it will be there long after the performance is forgotten. That is what MacArthur understood on that deck, that the document was permanent and the performance was not, and that the most powerful thing he could do in the face of the performance was simply to wait for the pen to touch the paper and let history do the rest. If this story gave you a new understanding of what happened on the deck of the USS Missouri on the morning the Second World War ended, do one thing before you go. Hit the like button, not for the algorithm, for the 60 million, for the men who did not come home from either side of that war and whose deaths made that document necessary. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going deeper into the history that the textbooks summarize in a paragraph, and that deserves so much more than a paragraph. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these deep dives, and leave your honest thoughts in the comments because I read every single one, and the conversation that happens there is always worth more than the video that started it. I will see you in the next one.